Strange goings-on in Dorchester Close, a new executive housing estate in Fulchester. Douglas Blandford and Anita Sanderson carried their colour supplement life into each other's bedrooms, and their spouses, Christine Blandford and Trevor Sanderson, seemed to be filling the gap, as it were, by an equally mutual exchange of feelings. But Trevor Sanderson, a natural philanderer, took up with a third woman, Margaret Lawler, and this upset the apple cart. At a barbecue party in her garden on June the 15th, Margaret Lawler was gravely wounded by a kebab spit held by Mrs. Blandford. The prosecution says it was malicious wounding, occasioned by the accused's jealousy. She says she slipped on the wet grass. The prosecution has called Mr. Curtis, who is now being cross-examined by Miss Tate.
Mr. Curtis, to return to the incident on June the 15th. Now, your description of it was remarkably detailed. What time elapsed between Mrs. Lawler offering her plate for food and receiving the injury?
Well, I didn't time it with a stopwatch. It all happened so quickly.
And yet you observed it in such detail?
Yes, I did.
You say that Mrs. Blandford was screaming incoherently. Now, you would admit that when someone slips, they tend to shout incoherently.
She was screaming abuse.
Incoherent abuse? If it was incoherent, how did you know it was abuse?
One could tell from her tone of voice.
Did you say to my learned friend, in the pretense of offering Mrs. Lawler a kebab, Mrs. Blandford lurched forward?
Yes.
Well, how did you know it was a pretense? Wasn't Mrs. Lawler holding up a plate for food?
Yes.
Mr. Curtis, you must have remarkable powers of perception if you're able to distinguish between what a person does and what they appear to do.
It was a deliberate action.
You say Mrs. Blandford lurched forward. Now, would you agree that when one slips, in order to regain one's balance, one can lurch forward?
It was a deliberate lurch.
When you saw Mrs. Blandford and Mr. Sanderson, as you say you did, in the Royal George Hotel in Preston, you thought that their being together was no business of yours?
Yes, indeed.
Yet you appear to have gathered a great deal of information about these people whose conduct, you say, was no business of yours, and whose behaviour you describe as disgusting.
Well, I couldn't help it.
Mr. Curtis, do you really expect this court to believe what you say when it is perfectly clear, in spite of your protestations to the contrary, that you consistently spied on your neighbours, and you jumped to conclusions about a relationship which you had no evidence was improper?
I wouldn't dream of spying on them. I was too disgusted.
Quite so. Mr. Curtis, do you belong to the Fulchester Tennis Club?
Yes, I do.
Are you also, indeed, the secretary of that club?
I have had that honour for some years past, yes.
Is it not regarded in certain circles as a very desirable organisation to belong to socially?
I wouldn't say so. It's just a tennis club.
But the subscriptions are rather high.
Yes.
And are all new members vetted by the secretary?
The secretary and the membership committee, yes.
Did you and your membership committee not refuse an application from Mr. and Mrs. Sanderson and Mr. and Mrs. Blandford in May of last year?
We were oversubscribed.
Well, according to my information here, more than 20 new members had joined by the end of the season last year.
I don't recall the exact number.
Well, why did you really refuse the application of the Blandfords and the Sandersons? They could afford the subscription, could they not?
The ability to be able to afford the subscription is not the sole criterion for membership of the club. I felt they wouldn't have fitted in. They were not worthy to be members.
Oh, surely, Mr. Curtis, that's not a very neighbourly action. You were prejudiced against them, weren't you?
I don't think so.
You didn't approve of these people, did you?
I don't approve of their way of life.
Do you bear any particular grudge against Mrs. Blandford?
Not at all.
When the Blandfords moved in, did you feel better disposed towards them than you do now?
Yes, I did.
Why was that?
Well, I didn't know them well then, or what they represent. I was being neighbourly.
You seem to think you knew Mrs. Blandford well enough in March of last year to suggest you go to bed together.
Certainly not.
But you did invite her to accompany you to the Lake District.
I have never wanted to take Mrs. Blandford anywhere, least of all the Lake District.
Mr. Curtis, I suggest to you that you made an improper suggestion to Mrs. Blandford, and as a result of her refusal, your testimony here today is based not on truth, but on your own hurt pride.
Certainly not. I am a happily married man. To me, all carnal appetites outside marriage are to be deplored and resisted. I have never made an improper suggestion to anyone in my life.
No further questions, Mr. Curtis?
No re-examination, my lord.
Very well, you may stand down.
And that concludes the case for the prosecution, my lord.
I call Mrs. Christine Blandford, my lord.
is your religion?
Church of England.
Take the testament in your right hand and read aloud the words on this card.
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
You're Mrs. Christine Blandford of 42 Dorchester Close, Colchester.
Yes.
Do you have any children, Mrs. Blandford?
Yes. My little boy Justin is 7, and my little girl Deborah is 4.
Do you have any strong views on the bringing up of your children?
Yes, I do. I think discipline has gone quite by the board in this modern age. A lot of my friends think I'm terribly old-fashioned because I think a mother's place is in the home. But I made a vow not to go out to work while my children were young. It gives them security to have a mother at home. It gives them an emotional sheet anchor in a stormy world.
Mrs. Blandford, do you find that your views are often at odds with those of your friends and contemporaries?
Oh, yes, I'm afraid I do.
And do you find that they sometimes lead you into arguments?
Yes.
Did one such argument occur with Mrs. Lawler on the night of the party?
Well, I wouldn't call it an argument exactly. It was more a difference of opinion. Arguing is for politics and things like that, and I have no time for it. I'd never met Mrs. Lawler before, so I'd no way of knowing what her opinions were, but I was quite forthright, as I always try to be.
How did this difference of opinion occur?
Well, although I don't go out to work, I do give leather and suede parties in my home sometimes. Well, Mrs. Lawler seemed to take exception to this, which I thought was rather strange, because everybody on the estate gives a sales party at some time or another, or make-up or lingerie. Well, Mrs. Lawler seemed to think there was something wrong in it. She didn't like animals killed. Well, I said, I don't like cruelty to animals either, but we do have to kill them for meat, don't we? And I noticed Mrs. Lawler wasn't a vegetarian, so I couldn't really see the logic in it.
Did this argument make you feel any hostility towards Mrs. Lawler?
Oh, no. She was my guest. Well, I thought she had a bee in her bonnet, but I was prepared to accept that. I suppose I have some in mine. But she persisted. She seemed determined to disagree with everything I said. She called me a stay-at-home mouse. Oh, but that to me isn't an insult.
Did you pursue Margaret Lawler in order to engage her in an argument?
Oh, there were upwards of 50 people at that party, and I was the hostess. How could I have?
Mrs. Blandford, we have heard that a number of people left the party at 9 o'clock.
Yes.
Why was that?
Well, quite frankly, I think Margaret Lawler had made herself unpleasant to many people.
Had she been drinking?
I really couldn't say.
Had you had much to drink that evening?
Well, I had more than I usually do if I'm at a party as a guest. But then I think if you're the hostess, you do, don't you?
Now, shortly before the incident in which Mrs. Lawler was injured, where were you standing?
On the grass behind the queue.
And what was the condition of the grass?
Well, it had rained. And of course I realise now that the grass was terribly slippery.
What sort of shoes were you wearing?
Well, I was wearing sort of cork platforms, and I can see that they were quite unsuitable because it was partly due to them that I slipped and lost my balance.
Now, how were you serving the kebabs?
Well, there was a huge bowl of saffron rice, and the people helped themselves to rice, and then I asked them to hold out their plates so that I could scrape the meat off the kebab.
Now, can you remember exactly what happened when Mrs. Lawler came forward to be served?
Well, yes. She really wasn't near enough, and I would have had to reach right over the burning fire to serve her. So I came round behind the spit to get closer, and in doing so I slipped.
Now, did you pick out a fresh kebab for Mrs. Lawler?
Yes, I did.
Why was that?
Well, the old one was gristly, and it had gone quite cold, and, well, I did it to please her because of the little difference we'd had earlier. I did it as a sort of peace-offering kind of thing.
Now, it has been said, Mrs. Blandford, that you were screaming abuse at Mrs. Lawler. Is that true?
Oh, no.
Did you scream at Margaret Lawler?
Oh, yes, I did. I screamed, "Be careful, it's hot," because she came forward. And then I twisted my ankle as I slipped.
And then what happened?
Well, I could feel myself falling, and I had nothing to hold on to except the burning charcoal in front of me, and the kebab seemed to fly out of my hand. It was a nightmare.
Was it an accident?
Oh, yes, of course. How could it have been anything else? To strike someone with a kebab stick in front of all those people? Who in their right mind would do a thing like that, however much they disliked somebody? Oh, not that I did dislike her, of course. It would be madness.
Now, did Margaret Lawler indicate in any way that she thought it had been done deliberately?
No.
Was this the first time you'd met Mrs. Lawler?
Yes.
But you did know of her existence?
Oh, yes. I knew she worked at the Polytechnic.
Was she, to your knowledge, having an affair with Trevor Sanderson?
No, I neither knew nor cared.
Mrs. Blanford, may I ask you, have you at any time had an affair with Trevor Sanderson?
Well, not an affair, exactly.
Did you commit adultery with him?
Well, I was foolish once or twice, my
Will
lord.
you please make it perfectly clear? Did you or did you not commit adultery with Trevor Sanderson?
Yes, I'm afraid so, my lord.
Mrs. Blanford, when did you last commit adultery with Trevor Sanderson?
6 months or more.
And who terminated this association?
I did.
Why was that?
I came to the conclusion it was wrong, and I couldn't go on with it.
How long did the association with him last?
Only a few months. I felt so terribly guilty. I felt ashamed to look my children in the face. I realized I'd been living in a fool's paradise, and I'd made a mockery of my marriage vows. I could see myself as I was on my wedding day, and I thought, to think I'd stoop to this.
Did you tell Trevor Sanderson that you wished to discontinue this liaison?
Yes, I did. I remember the day. We went to Fountains Abbey in the snow. It seemed the right place, all those sad ruins.
Yes. How did he react to what you had to say?
He seemed broken-hearted, but I was quite firm.
Did he ask you to sleep with him again?
Yes, frequently.
And did you?
No.
Why not?
Well, I think it's easier for a man to be promiscuous than a woman. I think fundamentally all women only need one man. It's different for men.
Mrs. Blanford, are you a jealous woman?
No, I don't think jealousy achieves anything.
Were you aware that your own husband was conducting an affair with Mrs. Sanderson?
Oh, yes.
Well, were you jealous of Anita Sanderson?
No, not jealous. A little unhappy, perhaps. I told Doug, my husband, that it was time to call it a day because of all the talk. Oh, and because it was wrong. In fact, especially because it was wrong. Things were being said to the children at St. Geoffrey's by other children, and, well, I didn't want to become involved in any more gossip.
Mrs. Blanford, are you and Anita Sanderson close friends?
We were.
And are you now?
No.
Why?
I think she wants my husband. She wants me out of the way.
Mrs. Blanford, were you aware that Margaret Lawler was close friends with Trevor Sanderson?
No.
Did you find a letter from Margaret Lawler in Mr. Sanderson's pocket and then show it to Anita Sanderson?
No, I didn't. I was brought up to believe that personal privacy, was sacred.
Have you ever seen this letter before? Exhibit 2, my lord.
Never. Even if I had, I would never have read it.
Now, when did you last sleep with Trevor Sanderson?
I can't remember the exact date. I prefer to forget it.
Well, I'm afraid you'll have to remember the exact date, Mrs. Blanford.
Well, the middle of November, Halloween. We went to a big party and...
Halloween, Mrs. Blanford, falls on the eve of All Souls' Day, October the 31st.
Yes, my lord. That was the date, then.
What are your feelings towards Trevor Sanderson now?
Indifference. I feel indifference. I have for a long time. I realize now that marriage and children are the most important things in life. Anything else is a recipe for misery.
Mrs. Blanford, are you on good terms with your next-door neighbour, Mr. Curtis?
No, I'm sorry to say.
Why is that?
Well, I've always got along beautifully with all the neighbours on any estate I've ever lived on. That's 5 or 6 estates. This was the first time I felt it was impossible to rub along.
Would you tell the court why?
Well, we were friends with the Curtises at first. We invited them into our home. And then, out of the blue, one Saturday evening, on the middle of March last year, I was preparing dinner in the kitchen, and Mrs. Curtis and my husband were admiring our mahjong set. And Mr. Curtis came into the kitchen, and he put his hand on my bottom, and he did ask me to go to the Lake District with him, and he used a disgusting expression. I was horrified. A man like that, I don't know how I got through that dinner. A man of his age. He just sat there all evening, undressing me with his eyes. I felt naked. Since then, I've been very distant.
Why did you invite the Curtises to your barbecue party?
Well, one must show some neighbourliness, and Mrs. Curtis has always been very pleasant.
Mrs. Blanford, did you apply to join the tennis club in May last year?
Yes, I did. I like tennis. It keeps you healthy, and I was the under-17 West Midlands champion in the doubles.
Was your application successful?
No. Everybody thought it would be. We were naturals, Doug and I.
Were you given any reason why your application was turned down?
No, but Mr. Curtis is the secretary of the club and controls admissions.
Thank you, Mrs. Blanford.
Mrs. Blanford, was the party on June the 15th a success?
Well, how could it be after that awful accident?
Yes, quite. But up to the time when the accident happened, would you say it had been a successful evening?
Reasonably, yes.
And yet we've heard that 15 or 20 people left at 9 o'clock before they'd eaten. That's hardly the sign of a successful party, is it?
Well, it was a cool night, and Margaret Lawler had been unpleasant.
So you want us to believe that a stranger drove away 15 or 20 people? She must have been very offensive indeed.
Well, they didn't all leave because of her.
Did some of them leave because of your behaviour, then?
No, I was being what I thought was a good hostess.
You say you drank more than usual. Well, how much is more than usual?
Well, I couldn't tell you exactly. You know how it is. You put half a glass down somewhere and somebody fills it up.
You didn't know how much you drank. You were, in fact, drunk, weren't you?
I wasn't drunk. But I think the drink was partly the reason why I slipped.
And may it not also have been the cause of letting your social mask slip and allowing your true feelings to appear when you stabbed Margaret Lawler?
I didn't. I didn't stab her. I couldn't stab anyone. I didn't.
Now, you'd never spoken to Mrs. Lawler before that evening, had you?
No, never.
Did you like her?
Well, I found her conversation interesting because her viewpoint was different from mine.
Yes, you had a dispute with Mrs. Lawler about child rearing.
I don't know where this word dispute comes from. It was an intellectual discussion.
Do you think your children have been well brought up?
Yes.
So you think a woman that has extramarital affairs and condones her husband's adultery is capable of bringing up children well?
I don't have extramarital affairs. I was foolish once or twice with Trevor.
Foolish once or twice. Now, is being foolish a euphemism for having sexual intercourse?
Yes, I suppose
And
so.
sexual intercourse outside marriage constitutes an extramarital affair.
Not if it's only once or twice.
Only once or twice? Well, how many times was it, Mrs. Blanford? Was it once? Or was it twice? Or was it 3 times? Or was it more?
I didn't count.
Too numerous, in fact, was it?
No, it wasn't like that at all. It was hateful. I didn't want to go with him. I had to. There was nothing left for me to do when Doug went mad on Anita.
So I think the relationship between these couples has been sufficiently established, Mr. Lawyer.
Yes, with respect, my lord, the pattern of behaviour among these people is important in establishing a motive for the crime.
Oh, very well. Mrs. Blanford, would you like to be seated?
No, thank you, my lord. I'll stand.
And this sexual relationship ended on Halloween, suddenly?
Yes.
Well, if you no longer had any physical relations with Mr. Sanderson, why did you continue to see him?
His wife visited my husband on Mondays and Thursdays, and I went to see him because I wanted everyone to think I was still having an affair with him.
You wanted everybody to think you were still having an affair with him?
Yes. It's terrible for a woman on the estate if she can't get a man.
Mrs. Blanford, are you aware of what you are saying?
It's the truth, my lord. There's only one shame, and that's in not having a partner of some kind.
By the way, where were your children whilst these matrimonial exchanges took place?
In bed. Or sometimes I took them to Mr. Sanderson's with me.
Now, you say, Mrs. Blanford, that it was you who told Mr. Sanderson that you no longer wanted to go to bed with him.
Yes.
Or wasn't it rather Mr. Sanderson who indicated that he was growing tired of you?
No, he loved me.
Indeed. Were you not afraid that he was flattered by the attentions of Margaret Lawler and that she had supplanted you in his affection?
No, he told me she was a friend.
And you believed?
Yes, of course.
How old are you, Mrs. Blanford?
35.
Do you know how old Mrs. Lawler is?
No, I don't.
Well, she's 26. 9 years, that's quite a difference, isn't it, Mrs. Blanford?
I never thought about it.
When did you find the letter from Margaret Lawler in Mr. Sanderson's pocket?
I didn't.
You never looked in his pockets?
No, I don't do things like that.
I see. Now, Miss Blanford, how well do you know Dennis Curtis?
Well, he's a neighbour who dislikes me. Everybody knows everybody on the estate.
Intimately, it would seem. Now, did you speak to Mr. Curtis when you saw him in the hotel in Preston on April the 18th?
No.
But you did know he was staying in the same hotel as you?
I didn't go to any hotel in Preston. I have relatives in Preston. I'd hardly be likely to go staying in hotels, would I?
But you signed in at the George Hotel on April the 18th as Mr. Sanderson's wife, didn't you?
No, I didn't.
Well, Mr. Sanderson was there on that occasion with a woman, and you were that woman, weren't you?
No, it could have been anybody. Margaret Lawler, I shouldn't wonder.
So you are jealous of Margaret Lawler?
No.
Mrs. Sanderson says you gave her a letter written by Margaret Lawler. When did you do that?
I didn't. Oh, Anita must have found it. They were always supposed to be so open and above board with each other.
You knew of this letter's existence, then?
Well, there had been talk about it.
But you said you'd never seen it.
I hadn't.
But you must have known, if there'd been talk about it, that Mr. Sanderson and Mrs. Lawler had at some time had a sexual relationship.
Everybody chopped and changed. You didn't know what to believe.
And this gossip wouldn't have bothered you because you were not having a sexual relationship with Mr. Sanderson and you were not staying in a hotel with him in Preston. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, Mrs. Blandford, you're a clumsy woman.
Clumsy? No. I went to ballet school from the age of 3.
So you aren't prone to accidents.
Well, yes, sir. No, I'm not prone to them, but they can happen to anyone.
But you were clumsy on the night of the party.
No, I slipped. I wasn't used to cork platforms. As a matter of fact, I've thrown them away since because of the accident.
How many people did you serve before Mrs. Lawler?
About a dozen, I can't remember.
About a dozen, and you hadn't found out that the grass was slippery.
Well, yes, of course I had, but I was busy, and I have said I had rather a lot to drink. I'm one of these people that get high on drink, I suppose because I'm not used to it.
But you said to me earlier that you weren't drunk. Now you're saying you were high on drink. Well, were you or weren't you?
I wasn't drunk, but it affected me.
Now, when you proffered Mrs. Lawler the kebab, you say that you shouted out, "Be careful, it's hot." Well, why do you think that nobody else present heard those words, but instead interpreted that as screaming abuse?
Well, there was a lot of noise.
And why do you imagine that Mrs. Lawler and Mrs. Sanderson and Mr. Curtis, all eyewitnesses, can't accept the fact that it was an accident?
Because they've all got an axe to grind, every one of them.
Oh, they're all lying, are they? For some reason best known to themselves.
Yes, they are lying, all of them. And I know why. They've got it all fixed up between them. It's because I want to go back to a decent way of living, husbands and wives as it should be. But they want me out of the way because it's more convenient for them. But I've upset their apple cart, all 4 of them, because I believe in decency and marriage, and I'm not going to let it go on. I've got my children to think about. What kind of world are they growing up in? They don't know who to call father or mother.
So that's why you stabbed Margaret Lawler, in the interests of morality.
I didn't stab her.
The case of the Queen against Blandford will be resumed tomorrow in the Crown Court.
Well, I must put this one over here. I mean, we'll have some starch if you'd like it. We must keep it up.